really comes down to my parents. So my dad is a second generation Canadian. My mother was from Ireland, and both of them actually met in India while traveling. So growing up, I mean, travel became this big part of my childhood. And early on, I became exposed to this incredible inequality that exists in the world today. I mean, 3 billion people live on less than 250 a day. And for a world that's achieved the kind of incredible advancements in technology, medicine, science, I mean, it's ridiculous to think that that kind of inequality still exists. I mean, it's crazy. It just boggles my mind. And getting exposed to that early on was, I mean, you read about this, you hear about it, you see it on commercials on TV, getting exposed to that, coming from largely growing up in Canada, it was a big eye opener early on. So from there, I mean, after high school, I was really lucky to be able to attend university in Canada, where I studied business and anthropology. And I think that combination had a really big effect on me personally. On the business side, I fell in love with strategy and entrepreneurship. I saw huge potential for entrepreneurs to take these vague ideas and manifest them against all odds. And that was just this really inspiring piece. And in anthropology, on the other side, I love to read. I love to dig deep on that side. And, I became exposed to global development and colonialism and all of the problems that have happened when people have tried to do good, but in really thoughtless ways or in ways that had all of these unintended consequences that made the situation much worse than where we started. So, I mean, in anthropology, I saw a lot of great critiques, but not a ton of answers and definitely not a ton of people ready to take action. And in business, I almost saw the reciprocal of that. Many practically minded people, action-oriented folks who were ready to get stuff done, but without the kind of critical perspective that understood what was happening in the world outside of the ivory towers of academia and the glass-plated towers of industry. So I think for me, what really makes me is a tension between these two, being as thoughtful and knowledgeable on an issue that I find important, namely global poverty, but also being biased to action by trying to work with people who are equally thoughtful and biased to action. And I think these two really keep each other in check, in that being too biased to action leads to horrible repercussions, but being too thoughtful leads to inaction altogether. So trying to combine those in a way that creates the best world possible. I think in terms of global poverty, what got us into this mess is definitely not going to get us out of it. I mean, my big question is, what can the individual do? Over the past 15 years, there's been this great trend in industry of organizations like Acumen Fund and LGBT Venture Philanthropy, looking for solutions to big problems that affect emerging economies. Things like access to water, access to healthcare, energy, financial capital, the things that clearly we would have access to if you're starting up an organization in, say, LA or New York or Vancouver. But if you're an entrepreneur in, say, rural Kenya or Uganda or India or Latin America, parts of Latin America anyway, you may not have these premises to build off of. I think organizations looking to scale up proven solutions to these problems are great. I see organizations like Acumen Fund doing fantastic work. The problem is they're not looking to go below a certain benchmark. One of the standard cutoff questions for these kind of organizations is, do you have 2 years financials? And if you don't, you're not eligible. And that makes sense from the perspective of these organizations in that they're trying to build an industry that simply didn't exist. But I think we've come to a point now where we need to take a look at what's happening below that. There are brilliant, absolutely brilliant entrepreneurs solving problems they're seeing in their own communities. And I think that's what we're trying to change the game of. We're trying to change the mentality there that says, we have to have a proven solution before we can take risk on it. And there's brilliant entrepreneurs out there that are worthy of that risk. And that if their ideas could be scaled up, could have dramatic impact. So the difference really, I think, is that instead of funding, say, a school or a well and then going home and saying, okay, we did our part, I think we need to start really looking at funding potential game changers in education and water that can really change the way we think about these problems. essentially what we do is we find game-changing social entrepreneurs, people who have brilliant new business model ideas on how to change global poverty. We find them at the very early stage and support them through capital and capacity building support. Our goal in working with these kind of entrepreneurs is to get them to the point where they're investment ready by the larger market. So we don't want to just work with them and then hands off and say goodbye. We want to find out who would be the most appropriate next level funder and make sure they're building towards that. There's great ideas out there, but unless they can achieve scale, kind of scale they're hoping for, those ideas are trapped in these tiny little pockets. And I think the real impact comes when they do get proven out. They do have 2 years financials. They do have all of their ducks in a row and get to the point where they can come to an organization like, say, Acumen Fund and say, we're ready. Let's scale this up. The two big things, and this connects to that earlier idea of this tension between action-oriented and thoughtfulness, is first, fall in love with a problem and not a solution. There's this great Karl Popper quote that I really like, and it goes something along the lines of, to a man with a hammer, the whole world looks like a nail. And I think there's a real danger in coming up with a new technology or a new business model and saying, this is awesome, this is going to change everything, look at these problems this could solve. Technology is great, but then you need to take that extra layer and make sure that technology is the right fit. And I think if you start with the problem first, you can figure out what else is being done for that problem and really figure out what needs to be disrupted, where those inflection points are. And I think that's a really important concept. Definitely, this space, any big problem really is going to be messy. There's going to be many different actors at the table, and that's going to take some time to suss through. But I think the second thing is to do a deep dive and be really, really thoughtful on the issue that you take on, and not to just jump into it with the next big thing and hope that it's going to be an actual innovation. So I think first, figure out which problem you want to bite off and make sure that it's a problem that's a good fit for you. I don't try to solve chemistry problems because I'm not a chemist. And if I did, I'd probably get my hands full of a corrosive material and burn myself. In issues like global development, I can extend that metaphor and say, I've spent some time looking at this. If you haven't, make sure you do spend some time, because otherwise it's not your hands that get burned. It's hands of somebody who is incredibly vulnerable, potentially. And I think that's where the responsibility for making sure we are thoughtful is even more so. And then on the other side, the third point, really, I think, is to do things. And again, I think there's a tension between doing things and being thoughtful. You need to spend as much time thinking about the issue as possible, but no more. Eventually you have to pull the trigger and get ready to go take some action. So, and I think that these two aren't necessarily sequential. I think that these things happen in tandem. So, be really thoughtful, get prepared, do something, and then make sure you stay thoughtful through that process. There's one question that you asked on in the original script that you'd sent, that what gave you the courage to push this project into new territory? And I gave this question a lot of thought. And at first I wrote down some kind of canned answer about, being inspired, and all that's true. But then I thought I would tell a story that I don't often tell. And so I worked myself up to actually tell it. And so I thought, I got to take this opportunity. So when I was young, my mother was actually diagnosed with a disease called polycystic kidney disease, or PKD. And it's not entirely rare, but it's not entirely common either. And essentially what it is at some point during your lifetime, your kidneys will fail. And they'll fail quite rapidly, but you can never really know when it's going to happen. And so it's a bit of an unusual disease in that, with heart disease and the like, you can really plan into it and make sure you live your life in a certain way to postpone that. With PKD, you really don't know when it will strike. So it's a bit like getting diagnosed with, at some point in your life, you're going to be hit by a bus. Over the past 15 years, I've seen my mom struggle with this, eventually lose her kidneys and go on dialysis. And she's been actually quite fortunate after she was on dialysis. She found a donor who was incredibly generous in giving up one of their kidneys. And so now she's finally, after years of waiting and waking up every day to a machine at her side, at the point where she's starting to live life on her own terms again, which has been amazing. The thing is, for me, and the way this has affected me, is that the disease is genetic. And when she was diagnosed, I was diagnosed as well. And I haven't seen any manifestations, and that's been fantastic. But part of my push to really make this my focus was that, at any one moment, any of us, anyone watching this really, could be hit by a bus. I know that bus is probably coming, and so it's a little bit more of a tangible realization of that. And for me, I think for many people, really, my big question upon leaving university was, do I go out and I make as much money as I can, provide for my family, buy a nice house, and then get to the point where I can pick my issues and give back? Or do I try to bite off some of these big problems now, when I don't have those kind of means, but I have the energy and time to really give it a big push? I think it definitely takes both, especially in terms of, global philanthropy and that sort of thing. I don't mean to look down on the first piece of that, but for me, what really gave me the push there to take this forward is that I don't necessarily have that long timeline guaranteed. And, I think my greatest fear would be to get to that point too early and not achieve enough to leave this world a better place beforehand. So I think seeing the problems this world is facing, I think they're too big to ignore. And it's been incredibly inspiring to work with brilliant people that have had this huge opportunity to work with. So what really pushed me over the edge was this realization that, any of us, all of us, have just the amount of time that we have on this earth. And I think it's our onus to make sure we create the most value within that time. I'm wary to say one issue should have priority over the others. What I'd like to say is that we should all be focusing on what we're focusing on and seeing how that can create a better world together. Within that, I think one of the biggest pieces is collaboration and cross-pollination. I think that exists as a big important piece of this, both on a macro sense and a micro sense. I'll break each down. On a macro sense, I think we need to have more people realizing the gains made in one area and how they can be applicable in another area, both within, say, different scientific faculties as well as different countries. If a business model pops up that, say, has a really great model for gaining access to water in India, that could be replicable within Africa or Southeast Asia. And I think that kind of macro collaboration is incredibly important. On a micro scale, I think, especially within those who fund these kind of initiatives, I think there needs to be much more collaboration. From the work we do, we work at the very early stage. And all of our work is for naught if there aren't those later stage players who are going to come to the table and say, this problem is being addressed by this solution. Let's scale it up. Let's make it widespread. So I think making sure that those players are interacting and collaborating and sharing information is incredibly important. And I'm really excited about this trend that I do think is emerging of people who are addressing similar problems coming together to address those problems together.